The joys of live.
Yeah,
Um,
yes.
Welcome to Niche Conversations. I am Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Bruce March. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, first of all. Yeah, as you said, my name is Bruce March. I'm currently a graduate student studying employment relations, and I'm working as a graduate research assistant under Dr. Laurie Lee Oates on, CURSed, how the resource curse manifests in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's a really exciting project. I've been able to learn a lot and, really engage with the literature on this. And,
Mhm.
with that said, it's exciting, and I look forward to talking
Yeah,
about it.
we're going to be diving into both your posts in the project as well as the project as a whole. So you wrote a piece called A Just Transition, Good Economic Policy for Newfoundland and Labrador. Whew, I really can't talk this morning. Anyway, um, so we're going to be talking about that, and then we're going to be talking about how the piece relates to this larger cursed project that Dr. Laurie Lee Oates is leading, who is a former NiCHE editor as well as a former guest on NiCHE Conversations. Folks may remember. Um, so I thought we'd start off by talking about like very basic, what is a just transition?
Of course, of course. And, I would just say that, when you think about a just transition, you think immediately about environmental policy and addressing the climate crisis. And while it certainly is that, I would say it's more of a framework for shifting away to an economy that is based off of fossil fuels and resource extraction and moving towards something that's a bit more sustainable, inclusive, and, fundamentally fair.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I guess it's a bit about protecting the planet and people, especially, workers and communities who have historically depended on these industries that are, now in decline or under pressure to decarbonize. So, the future is a bit uncertain in that regard. But I would say just, here in Newfoundland and Labrador, this concept's really relevant. Our province has long been shaped by, natural resource industries, whether it was the cod fishery, that, sustained coastal communities for generations, real rich history there. Or, more recently, the offshore oil industry from, the late 90s, early 2000s that brought, wave of economic optimism, during the Williams era, for example. And,
Mm-hmm.
people really thought that, we were going to be a have province at that time. And, for the moment we were. But I would just say, as we've seen, time and time again, these industries are volatile. They're, highly exposed to global markets, environmental limits, shifting regulations. When the cod stocks collapsed in the early 90s, that was the largest Canadian layoff in Canadian history. Tens of thousands of people, and, we had record out-migration of people leaving the province. So when we talk about a just transition, if I just want to wrap that thought back, we're talking about planning ahead to report or to avoid repeating those same mistakes. It's a recognition that, I guess, climate action can't just focus on reducing carbon emissions. It has to be centered on people's lives and livelihoods. That means all workers shouldn't be left behind as we decarbonize. These people, they are the one that has driven these industries, and, they should be the priority there, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very centered on labor, I think, is a really key part of just transition. And I think what it really traditionally people argue that like mainstream environmentalism often forgets about the labor issue, often forgets about working class folks who depend on resource extraction,
Exactly.
etc., for their jobs. And a just transition is kind of taking some of the thoughts behind the environmental movement and kind of bringing them more into reality in a lot of ways. Yeah. So you mentioned The End of This World, Climate Justice in So-Called Canada in your post, and that's a book that I recommend everyone check out if you can. It's like an Indigenous focused look at just transition. Yeah, it's a really good book. So yeah. Okay, so you've touched upon it. But how do you see this just transition being a good policy for Newfoundland and Labrador? How would the province benefit from a just transition?
Well, there are a few ways that the province would benefit. First, I would just say that, we know that, as I said, that the province is highly vulnerable because of our reliance on a narrow band of resource sectors. When oil prices tank, as they have several times, we see huge government deficits, job losses, and people leaving the province to find work elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this is just one part of, I know we'll touch on it, but one part of the resource curse, for example. Um, you know, the idea that, instead of building lasting prosperity, the resources can destabilize the economy. So if I have to think about a just transition, sorry, that gives us a way out of that cycle. It means, investing in a diversified economy, not just oil and gas, but clean technology, energy, arts, sustainable tourism, care work.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also emphasize that this kind of shift would lead to, more stable long-term employment, especially, in more rural areas, indigenous reserves, the communities that are most impacted by this sort of extractivism.
Mm-hmm.
And, it would also, I think, keep young people in the province by creating, meaningful career paths, outside of just the extractive industries. I grew up in Louisbourg, for example, so, the only thing you're, dreamed to do, and not hating on Louisbourg, of course, but, you just went into the trades. And while that is, good work, a lot of respect to people to do that career, there is alternatives as well. So I would just think that I also think that the Youth Climate Corps and a jobs guarantee is a good example of policy that I think can be part of a just transition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Prime Minister Mark Carney, he ran his campaign on a slogan of "It's time to build," and I think if we're going to be building things, it should be like an east-west electricity grid or retrofitting houses. Not necessarily new pipelines that'll blow past our existing climate targets and won't be online for a decade or more.
Yeah.
I would also say, a just transition, it prepares us for what's coming. The world is moving this way towards off of fossil fuels, whether we like it or not. I know that in these times, the whole drill baby drill that we hear from the Trump administration and down south is a bit scary to a lot of us.
Mm-hmm.
But, even the oil companies in the U.S. are, encouraging, the administration not to ditch the Inflation Reduction Act and to, factor that into their decisions. So I would just say that the earlier we prepare, the better chance we have to shape the future on our own terms instead of scrambling at the last minute like we always do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. All good points. And brings us back kind of like to the overarching theme, which is how it's connected to this curse project, which revolves around the idea of the resource curse.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought maybe to wrap up our conversation today, if you could just reiterate or highlight how this just transition is linked to Newfoundland and Labrador's resource curse.
Yeah, so the term of the resource curse, it comes directly from, a paradox in economics and political science and various related disciplines, that when a region is rich in natural resources, like oil, like fish, like minerals, it can sometimes end up worse off in the long term. That's a bit of the paradox there. You think, of all these resources, it should be a blessing. And it might sound strange, but here in Newfoundland and Labrador, it really hits close to home. We've always been a resource-rich province, from the cod fishery to mining to hydroelectricity, offshore oil, and we've long depended on exporting raw materials. But we've seen time and time again that this dependence leads to short-term booms followed by long-term instability, bust, etc. Governments often ramp up spending when revenues are high, but when prices crashes like oil did in 2014 and again during COVID, during the Dwight Ball's government, I think, we're left with budget deficits, job losses, debt, etc. So, and also too, I'd like to highlight that the wealth generated doesn't always stay here. Big profits often go to corporations headquartered elsewhere. Many rural communities continue to face underfunded services, or when these corporations pull out of areas, the communities are left with even, what the private corporations could offer. They're now gone, and the public sector has been unfunded, and that's not there as well, leading to, job precarity, population decline, etc.
Yeah.
So I would just say that's really the essence of the resource curse. And, when I think about a just transition, or what it's supposed to be, it's more of a proactive way to fix it, instead of continuing to gamble on the next big project, as we like to do, in Newfoundland and Labrador with Muskrat Falls, or, now we have the MOU with Quebec and developing Gull Island. I would just say, we should build something that is a bit more resilient, a bit more diverse, rooted in long-term opportunity, community,
Yeah.
things like investing in education, skills training, public infrastructure, strengthening social safety nets. So it's not just about climate change. It is certainly about climate change, but it's not just good climate policy. It's good economic policy. It's going to help, communities and the people that are, most reliant on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining me today just to talk about your piece, to talk about some of like your personal connections to the province as well as this broader project. Um, I encourage people to check out both your article as well as the full project. There's going to be more blog posts coming on out of it periodically. Really excited for that. There is also an introductory post where Lori Leotes kind of explains the essence of the project if
Mhm.
people want to check that out. Yeah, it's exciting. And, um, I've thought about a just transition in relation to Saskatchewan, where I live. So it's good to hear it in relation to an Atlantic Canada province. A lot of the same issues, but slightly different situation, right? So, yeah. So thanks for joining me today, Bruce. This was great.
Yeah. Thanks, Jessica. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.